Thank you very much. And now over to Tim. I'll go to Tim now, and then I'm conscious that Professor Nico Sava needs to leave us soon. So I'll have a final question with you about the alcohol question that the students did earlier. I'm sure you've had some time to percolate on that. But over to Tim just now. Tim, thank you so much for coming. This is Tim Gray from the Health Optimization Summit. I have so much to thank you for, because if I didn't come to your summit, I wouldn't have met Dr. David Rabin, I wouldn't have interviewed him for my podcast, and I wouldn't have learned so much about the use of wearables. However, Tim, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Tell us a little bit about biohacking, what that is, and how different entrepreneurs have been microdosing. We see these videos on YouTube of different entrepreneurs that we respect doing microdosing of psychedelics, but also doing DMT ceremonies and having shamanic episodes. So tell us a little bit about the scene.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Biohacking is, I guess, the art and science of optimizing one's health and quantifying what you do. So it's not based on studies, potentially biased studies. It's N=1 times, several hundred, sometimes several thousands other times, and looking at the patterns in the data to see actually what works with no agenda. And so that can be obviously using pharmaceuticals, it can be using natural things, it can be using technologies, and we're, I guess, as biohackers, completely free without worrying about getting into trouble about talking about things that aren't within our training. So we have a lot of freedom, and I like to think it's at the forefront. There's also a lot of, what do you say, people that don't know what they're talking about as well, but it is advancing things quite well in a lot of areas, I'm finding. So that's really what biohacking is, in my opinion.
Okay, and tell us a little bit about microdosing and the use of psychedelics amongst entrepreneurs who go away and they have all these great insights.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with psychedelics since I was a teenager. I did it for very different reasons when I was younger, obviously. That was just to change my state, to get away from an unhappy state, I guess. But as I grew up, understanding more, and I was in psychology and cognitive hypnotherapy for most of my adult life, actually, realizing that it's a way of opening your mind and connecting the dots internally that you couldn't do otherwise. So I think microdosing is done so well because it doesn't necessarily tilt you, but if you've done the macrodosing in the past, you know what to look for and know how your brain works differently. So I find that I've done a lot of nootropics, from aniracetam or phenylpiracetam, or even nicotine and caffeine, and stacking all of these things. But I find that when it comes to microdosing, my brain works very differently. And I think, and this is what I've discussed with colleagues or friends, is instead of thinking in a linear fashion, i.e. if you were to retrace your steps for the day, I left the house via the front door, I got to the car, I drove down the road, I got out of the car, I walked into the shop. Instead of thinking in a linear fashion, I find that you can start from the point of house and go to any one of those points, connecting the dots in any order you like. And I think the analogy I think I've heard before, and I'm not sure if this came from you, Dave, but was, where was I going to go with that? Oh, crikey.
It'll come back.
Yeah, well, I know.
Taking a different path.
Yeah, the unconscious is a clever thing. It'll come to me in a minute. But yeah, so it's like when you are microdosing or macrodosing, yeah, you form new pathways, and it's like driving a car through snow, and you lay some new tracks, and the more times you do it, the more those tracks become solidified and harder to lose. And I find that for me personally, when I macrodose or microdose, then I find that my wordplay or puns or humor, it significantly increases for at least 2 or 3 weeks. The way I connect words is just, I can get 7 or 8 puns in a row the week after, and I'm quite well known for it. So it really does have a massive impact, in my opinion. Colleagues, I know several people in the Bay, and I know that several other prominent people talk about it and use it quite frequently. I think I was advised by someone to use it regularly, so that you can keep on forming those pathways and strengthening them. And so I have done, when obviously legal to do so, for well over a year now. And I found it to be very, very good. I find that I'm in growth mindset, or always in solution mindset. pretty much round the clock now. And instead of having my ego get in the way and challenging things from a negative perspective, I find that I'm open to the feedback and able to change very quickly. So I find that my learning as a result has increased very, very quickly, and I'm much more open and plastic, should I say. So that's what I found. And I think this is the general consensus amongst other biohackers or entrepreneurs or business people that are integrating it into their life.
Do we know how psychedelics work? I mean, why does it have a lasting effect? Dr. McIntyre had mentioned, you know, you don't need to wait for the 4 to 8 weeks for other drugs to kick in. So it's like it's a key. It just switches something on in the brain. So do we know how they work, Mohammad?
All right. So I mean, like many things in psychopharmacology, we're not completely sure, but there's a number of different theories in how they work. At a core level, almost all the psychedelics work on the serotonin 2A receptor as agonists, or for those of you not working in biosciences, they activate these receptors in the brain. There's a whole host of other receptor effects, but the main thing is the serotonin 2A receptor. But just like, I mean, in the chat, people were talking about SSRIs and the fact that they decrease reuptake of serotonin, thus increasing serotonin in between neurons, and we get the surge of serotonin. That's not the real effect. I mean, we think that there's a whole downstream effect of a number of different second messenger systems within the brain that lead to a different kind of neural connectivity. One of the hot topics today in psychiatry is the default mode network. So the default mode network refers to this mode in the brain, this set of circuits in the brain. Dr. McIntyre can speak about this as well, because his lab in Toronto has done a lot of research in neuroimaging on the default mode network. But it's basically a network that is on as a default in the brain, and it's involved in a number of different processes, including self-reflection and awareness and consciousness. And the belief is that in many different psychiatric disorders, that there is either an over or under activity of this network in a way that leads to negative filtering in terms of thoughts and perception about oneself and others in the future in the world. And what psychedelics appear to do, and this was shown in a number of elegant studies by Professor Carhart Harris in the UK, they appear to quiet down the default mode network. And so one study that they did in Imperial College, I believe, they gave a large dose of psilocybin, which is a psychedelic derived from psychoactive psilocybin-containing mushrooms. So it's a prodrug which is converted into psilocin. And it turns out that the default mode network, when you image with functional MRI, is quieted down when you give these doses. And that correlates with an improvement in depression, anxiety scores. Not only that, these effects seem to last much longer from a single dose than you would see with currently available medications. We're not sure why. We do know that when it comes to dosing psychedelics, the set and setting are very important. This has been talked about since the 1960s and 70s. And so the preparation and the debriefing after using them is very, very important in terms of the effect. We don't think about set and setting when you're giving an SSRI or any other standard antidepressant. So there seems to be a real interplay, and that's why you hear terms like MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. You don't hear something like SSRI-assisted psychotherapy. You hear, you give antidepressants, you give therapy, but they're in parallel. You don't really kind of mesh them. And I think it's this, my belief is this whole idea of the default mode network and how you prepare someone for the effects of the psychedelic.
Tim, we have one final question for you, and I then believe that you need to go because you had an hour slot with us. Thank you so much for your time. The question that we had was about stressed out city executives and why they turn to plant medicines to relieve stress from the crazy life that city life brings.
It's a good question. For me, if I speak for myself, I would say it's because it changes your state from, well, it puts you into parasympathetic mode from sympathetic, and a lot of us aren't actually switching off. You can often see this in people where you see that if there's a loud noise, they jump very quickly. They're always sleeping with one ear open and on high alert. But when they get into psychedelics, they often switch off and enjoy the experience. It's the first time that they actually seem to be in parasympathetic mode, which is kind of like ironic considering they're high. Yeah, I find that that's generally been the thing for me. Although I think with the use of psychedelics, it's helped me to let go of that and become more and more parasympathetic. And it was actually quite a quick transition as well. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for coming today.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I have
I'm just going to butt in here, just so that we move on we move from this topic or from this area. I'm just going to ask Dr. McIntyre. You know, you've spoken about ketamine being second-line drug, then first-line drug. Now we've seen these executives using psychedelics. My question would be, do you foresee a day when these drugs become or are used as a prophylaxis in stressful situations, as preventative measures like the pandemic that we're going through? Do you think that such a day would be in front of us?
I love your question because it speaks to the other part of the equation that historically psychiatry has perhaps not emphasized, and that is the prevention. We speak so much about treatment, but I think we would all have to agree the best treatment has to be prevention. And it's a larger question about, can we prevent mental illness? And the answer is we sure can. There's plenty of evidence to show that prevention of mental illness can take place through a variety of manipulating social determinants and or through pharmacologic intervention. So yes, we can prevent mental illness. Not all mental disorders have been evaluated in this way, but certainly some have. So conceptually, the answer is yes. The second part is that, and I understand the way you've crafted the question with executives taking it, they're under a lot of stress, they take a pill. And as you were describing that, it put me in mind of, when Leo Sternbach, he was the person in the mid-1950s in New Jersey who discovered the benzodiazepines. So the benzodiazepines are the Valium drugs. He discovered a drug called chlordiazepoxide, which was the first of the Valium type drugs. And many might remember that Valium was described as, in quotes, mummy's little helper, end of quotes, in the 60s. Certainly a very sexist moniker, but that was the thinking at the time. But the point was not lost. It was taken as a pill to kind of just take the edge off. Certainly, I cringe, frankly. I cringe at the notion that people would take psychedelics because they're having a bad hair day or a bad stress day. That makes me cringe. And I would be certainly never wanting these medications or, frankly, other psychiatric medications to be taken within that framework. But here's what I could envisage. What I could envisage is, and it's possible, that if these treatments, now Dr. Earl Swaden described it very nicely, the prevailing conceptual framework that is now proffered, that we think that what is really going wrong in the brain with people with depression or post-traumatic stress, other mental disorders, is there something wrong with the segregation, the integration, the reciprocity of brain circuitry. And if that is indeed correct, then a derivative of that is we need to reset that circuit. And I can think of a situation where, for example, a person is identified as being at risk of mental illness by virtue of the fact their parent or both parents have, for example, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or whatever the case may be. And a person may take a treatment as a way to prevent the declaration of that mental illness by resetting the circuit. That, of course, would need to be guided by best sciences. There's all kinds of externalities, negative externalities with doing such a thing, and we need to be very careful with that. But I do think going forward, this is interesting because, if anything, because COVID, I think, is going to really add a bit of tailwind to the want in the public health sphere for resiliency enhancement. And rather than only thinking about drugs in psychiatry as symptom mitigating, maybe we should be thinking about them as resiliency enhancing. And if that's true, and that's not meant to be some hyperbole or some cute sort of gymnastics with language, if that's true, and I think it is true, then that gives us a reason to believe they could be used in a prophylactic way. For example, we now know that exercise, a pill that nobody likes to swallow, but exercise resets the circuits in the brain. And guess what? Exercise is a vaccine. It's a vaccine against depression. It reduces the risk of depression greatly by about 10 to 20%. So it's not inconceivable that we could use a safe and effective pharmacologic agent under medical supervision to reset the circuit as well. So it's within the realm of coherence, possibility, and certainly it's a viable hypothesis to study. But I do cringe at the mummy's little helper approach. In fact, that's in part what has led to this debacle in North America with opioids. Among other things, there's many factors that led to that, but the insufficient medical surveillance of opioids, among other things, has driven this incredible public health crisis here.
Thank you very much for that. And before we go to part 2, we will need a break, MJ, now, but I just want to go back to Professor Nikos because I'm conscious of time and we've run over a little bit and we only had your grace for 1 hour. So I just wanted to say, what do you make of all of this? Just a little conclusion to part 1. What do you think after you've heard all of this, Professor?
I mean, fascinating. You know, it's been great for me to learn about you know, psychedelic drugs and the state of art of thinking in the use of these substances for mental health. I mean, the issue that we don't know exactly how they work, I think it's interesting. I think it's not the only walk of life where we're happy to use something we don't really understand. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind is something in my field of research, which is artificial intelligence. I mean, that's another series of tools that we don't have a great potential to solve problems in useful ways, but we have no idea how they work as well. So I see some parallels there. I mean, I think, and I will try to stick around for a little longer, even if I go mute. I'm fascinated to hear more about the business model of taking psychedelic drugs to the market, because, you know, as other speakers have alluded to, or even said explicitly, it's a very expensive and uncertain process. And when the sort of, you know, the substance under study is patent protected, I can see how the economics of these work. But if it's something that's not patent protected because it's been around for such a long time, then sort of, you know, obviously we need to find different business models to take something like this to the market. So I would love to hear some thoughts as to how the business model works. I think that the notion of safety first is really important. You know, fundamentally medicine moves, you know, through evidence. And if psychedelic drugs are to be used more widely, I think first we need to show evidence of safety and then evidence of efficacy. And in order for this to happen, this has to be packaged in a viable business model. And that's something I would love to find out more about.
Well, that's great.
Does that work?
That works. We're going to go into the business part now. So thank you very much. And I'm going to share your details in the chat right now, because the work that you do on machine learning, data mining, and your data science is just cutting edge. So thank you very much for coming and for contributing your hour. You are what makes LBS wonderful. So thank you very much. Okay, MJ, over to you. I'll stop interrupting you.
Thank you so much.
Honestly.
So you know, moving to part 2 of the evening, my question next to Misha is: we now know that there's a prospect in a new drug or a class of drugs. How do you go about getting into the business, getting the product into the market, and steps to commercialization?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think it's not something that any company would go into lightly. This is, let's not forget, not a couple of years and a couple of million that you'd spend and voila, we have a great chance of success. Absolutely not. This is something that's going to need huge infrastructure, deep pockets, and it's going to be incredibly time consuming. You have to start right at the beginning, pre-discovery, target identification, drug discovery. That it will take in itself a few $100 million and 4 to 5 years at the very least. You then move into preclinical testing, which is your very early efficacy and safety testing in computational models, cells, and in animals. And if all that goes well, within that sort of year and a half of that process, you can move into your first in man or phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. And that's in 20 to 100 men. You then move into phase 2, which is in 100 to 500 patients. And there you look at the efficacy. So in phase 1, you look at safety. In phase 2, you look at efficacy. And this is really to also look at dose and scheduling, potential side effects. And you're comparing your drug to placebo or to existing therapies. If that goes well, you move into phase 3, which is by far the most challenging of clinical trials, because you're looking at safety and efficacy in 1,000 to 5,000 patients in multi-centers. And you've got to make sure that that data is collated properly and analysed properly in a form that the regulator is going to be able to read fairly easily, and all this requires such a huge infrastructure. By this point, you're going to want to write all this up and present it to a regulator, and you're talking sort of 12 years around about, give or take, and a couple of $1 billion, I would say, to get to that stage. And let's not forget that for every drug that comes onto the market, there are around 10,000 that fail somewhere during that process. So this isn't for the faint-hearted, but what's really important is that we are data-led, and that we focus on robust clinical data to make our arguments for these drugs that are clearly showing and have clearly showed in the trials that we've already seen in centres all over the world, that these are hugely beneficial to those with treatment-resistant depression, to those with PTSD, to those with severe depressions. And I really think that we owe it to our patients to have this robust clinical data presented to the regulators and to work in collaboration with regulators. Because you can really learn a lot from that. And I think inevitably pharma companies are going to fail at some stage during that process, but actually when you work collaboratively, you can really learn a lot from those failures and use that to your advantage to present a far more beneficial, a far more robust package that looks at the patient's safety and efficacy side of things to really get the best possible drug onto the market. Yeah.
Do you mind if I add something there?
No.
Sure.
So I agree. Thank you so much for that, Misha. I agree with what you're saying, particularly when it comes to new drug development. But I think oftentimes we conflate new drug development which involves new patents on new substances, which it goes down the path what Misha just described, to the path that drugs that already exist that are well studied can take. So as an example, S-ketamine is a molecule that is the 1/2 of the mirror image of what is typically found in racemic ketamine, which is ketamine that's available and very, very cheap and now off patent. And so racemic ketamine is widely available. It's extremely cheap and you can get it anywhere. And then a drug company comes around and says, well, what if we just take half of that, the S half of that ketamine, and then we turn that into a nasal spray that we then sell and market? It turns out it has roughly equivalent effects as racemic ketamine, but all of a sudden that company that made that strategic decision can become a billion-dollar company that is making much more than they were selling racemic ketamine. And so there's what I think is interesting about the paradigm we're in right now is that many of the psychedelic medicines that are available, that we have a lot of evidence for their safety, meaning they've already gone through the effective phase 1 that the FDA typically requires to demonstrate safety, and have actually have a lot of substantial efficacy data, like psilocybin mushrooms, like MDMA, even LSD has been through probably more human studies than any other psychedelic medicine ever prior to it becoming illegal. And interestingly, there needs to be a shift in paradigm for how we approach these medicines that are off patent, because almost all the psychedelic medicines, some of the folks in the chat were mentioning Sasha Shulgin's work, FICAL and TICAL. These books talk about all of the medicine that Sasha Shulgin, who used to work for Sandoz, ended up patenting for $1 that are no longer able to be released in a protected manner. That does not mean that they are not useful. So what I think that is really interesting to think about is new strategies for the way that we can approach the successful commercialization of medicine that is off patent, that is not necessarily patentable, and then delivery systems for that medicine that could be patentable or protectable, that actually allow the company that puts the money in to make it, which is less than new drug development substantially. One example is MAPS. MAPS has raised since 1986. They've been doing this. They probably raised somewhere around $100 million, but not $1 billion, right? And then MDMA is in phase 3 trials, and it will be legal for doctors to use in clinic in the US by end of 2021, early 2022. Compass Pathways in London, whether you agree with the way that they've been doing things or not, they are a privately funded company, started, I believe, as nonprofit, converted to for-profit, and they are commercializing psilocybin by not patenting psilocybin, which you cannot patent. It's a natural molecule, but you can patent delivery systems. You can patent the way it's synthesized artificially. There are lots of other things that you can do that allowed them to raise the capital they needed to make this something they could bring to the public. So there's lots of other strategies out there that I think are really interesting that absolutely must be evaluated to get these medicines out rather than focusing on new drug development. I think new drug development is actually a huge waste of money and a red herring, because most of the drugs that we really care about in the psychedelic space have already been discovered and they're already off patent.
Okay, we've got a poll going on in the chat. If you guys can have a look and answer the poll, that would be interesting to see what would come out of that. Sorry.
So the poll says plant medicine versus pharmaceutical medicine. Would you trust a plant medicine more than a pharmaceutical medicine? Yes or no? Just there's a link to the poll in the chat. If you want to go to the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen, and then you can just answer that poll just for fun. Michael Kunif, LBS Masters in Finance alumni, thank you so much for coming. I put your question in the chat to give you some time to think about it. So back in 2019, Atai, a psychedelic medicine biotech company, managed to raise the largest ever private financing round at the time to fund a company interested in psychedelics. And this is your company that you work for. So tell us a little bit about you, the company that you work for, and what was going on back in 2019.
Yeah, sure. So I work for Atai Life Sciences, as mentioned, and we are a clinical development company focused on doing clinical trials, particularly around psychedelic compounds, looking at anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and similar indications in the spectrum of mental health. So I think one of the points I'd like to talk about is, I think it's important that the way we get these new drugs to patients and in a safe and effective manner is through clinical trials. And I think, as Misha pointed, clinical trials are expensive. But it is the current pathway to get new drugs approved through the regulators. So, I can appreciate why there might be a desire for alternate frameworks. These are the current regulatory approvals frameworks that we work with. And so that's why we're working through them, so that patients can be prescribed new indications and new drugs.
Yes.
That are safe and demonstrated to be efficacious. I think one of the questions earlier on was about, well, why is alcohol legal and psychedelics are not? I think that they're very different substances. And I think one of the things that, that it strikes me, having joined the company fairly recently, is there's a lot of anecdotal discussion and there's a lot of recreational discussion, and a lot of it is positive. But there's also people have had some very negative experiences with these compounds, and it's unfortunate for those people. And so that's why I think we do need to have these clinical trials and get the data solid and robust, so that as we move forward into commercialization and prescription, it's in a controlled way and it's done in the best interest of the patient. I mean, one of the earlier conversations was about, this is going to be assisted therapies, and it is. This isn't going to be, you go to Boots, you get a bag and a pill, and you go home. This is a complex, medical intervention, and it requires, scientific research and data and clinical trial, all that investment.
Well, actually, Jeremy Watts. Jeremy, are you with us actually on this call? So Jeremy in the chat said no to the poll. We're doing this poll. Trusting, are you with us?
Yes, I'm Stephanie. Hello.
Hello. Would you like to pose your point to Michael and he can respond to that?
Yeah, I just think simply something being from a plant doesn't necessarily mean it's safe, does it? There's plenty of plants that will... morphine comes from a plant, doesn't it? And it's not...
I think I agree. I think
dangerous.
Yeah.
So I just think that constitutes an appeal to nature fallacy, doesn't it? Just simply assuming that something comes from a plant, therefore it's safe.
Yeah.
Or
look, I would agree, and I think we're essentially putting a clinical substance through a clinical trial. Like these are drugs, and I think whether they come from a plant or whether they're synthetic, the structure of the trial and things like that needs to be the same. We need to be concerned about the same level of safety for the patient, the same desired patient outcome, and the same level of efficacy. I mean, like whether something's plant or compound or synthetic, is fine. I mean, I think for me, one of the interesting areas, and we talk about patents a little bit, is people are using a small range of molecules now, because there's a small number of studies in this. But is there possibility in the future to look at synthesized compounds that perhaps deliver a smaller trip or a more, a different outcome for the patient that's better for their mental health, a more controlled response, still leveraging the same, benefits, but in a more controlled way.
Thank you for that. And Kathy Brewis, you have a point here about most medicines are derived from plants. Are you with us on the call?
Well, I'm obviously no expert, but I'm just thinking of, a lot of, aspirin and all sorts which come from, are derived from plants ultimately. I think the sort of plant versus non-plant is a bit of a red herring, to be honest.
I think I completely agree with you and agree with Michael as well. I think the red herring is plant versus non-plant. I think the real question is whole plant versus part plant. Mm-hmm. When you think of what we're talking about, aspirin comes from a plant. Almost every single medicine we use in Western culture originally came from a plant. Where else would they come from before we had the ability to do complex synthesis and extraction? I mean, ultimately, what we are doing is we're taking these complex plant substances, we're trying to theoretically reduce them down to their most fundamental active ingredients that are patentable, core word there, and then that allows us to make a whole lot of money and by protecting them and delivering to the public. It is not because the pharmaceutical medicine is better than the whole plant, it's because we can't patent a whole plant legally. And so when you really think about why we go one route versus the other, traditionally it's because you can protect one and you can't protect the other from a business perspective.
I think the other comment I'd make too is about the compounds is consistency is really important, and consistency of the product you're getting and delivery of the dose. One of the things that concerned me earlier on in the conversation about busy, stressed executives, using these compounds is like, just as a person, if you're self-prescribing, sourcing and self-delivering, I think that's a very dangerous, that has potential to be a very dangerous situation. And I think we need to be really clear that you recognize that yes, it's happening. Yes, it's more recreational and anecdotal, but it's not the same as clinical, and it is not the activities that's going to get us to new drug indications to help patients who have unmet mental health needs.
Absolutely. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's safe. Just because it's not natural doesn't mean it's safe.
It's also not clinically it's also not clinically significant. So I mean, like the people who are anecdotally using it, that's not a data point you can go to a regulator with and say, look, you know, based on this casual outcome, therefore I want to make this drug legal and get prescribers to do it. And I also don't think, you know, we have to show some respect to the prescribers and the mental health experts that are supporting these patients and who care for them, is they're not going to start prescribing this stuff on that kind of data either. So I think, you know, we do have to go through this regulatory framework. It's the framework we work and operate in, but it is the way we get safe and effective drugs to patients.
Absolutely. What we're doing here is a snapshot of what some patients are doing. Some patients are self-medicating, taking their healthcare into their own hands, and maybe not going to a psychiatrist, maybe not going to a therapist. Maybe they're trying to solve their mental health problems any which way they can, be it pharma, street, otherwise, or just thinking.
And I think, yeah,
because in those instances, it doesn't really matter what the regulator thinks. It's what they think, what they feel is right for them, which may or may not be in line with FDA regulations, unfortunately, or in fact legality. It seems to be more of a morality choice for a lot of patients rather than a regulation choice. Most patients don't really care about whether it works for somebody else. They care more about whether it's going to work for them.
I think people's mental health, patients' mental health is very specific to them, their history, their journey, and the interventions they've had. I think, you know, to be clear, my view is that psychedelic as a medical intervention is a very significant intervention. It's not something casual. It is quite a significant intervention. And there's lots of people for who, there's lots of people who for the existing pathways has helped. A lot of people, therapy helps. It's going to be multiple options for people. I think one of the comments I hear quite a lot, and I just want to comment on too, is the impact of COVID. And I think one of the things I hope is that a lot of people have described feeling anxious or concerned about their mental health because of COVID. And I think it's perfectly right that people should feel anxious because that's a natural environment to the situation we're in. But I hope what that gives us is an empathy for people that feel extreme anxiety and don't have access to, you know, to treatment and healing that they need, because that is it's not the same as what a lot of people are going through now. Like, it's far more amplified, and I hope out of that we get some empathy for
that. I was going to ask Dr. McIntyre to introduce us to his company, Champignon Brands, Human Optimization Science Company. Can you tell us a bit about the company and any trials ongoing?
Let me start with the impetus, because often the runway that leads up to the company may provide some insights as to really what the company's overarching aims are. And frankly, after many decades of being involved in discovery and development and repurposing of existing medications, along with what I had described a little earlier, that being the day-to-day process of how you do this and outsourcing to clinical research organizations and so many promising molecules that have unfortunately not made it across the finish line, we said we have to do things differently. And for us, what that meant is that we had to, in fact, keep the development of products within our own guardrail, so to speak. And so the Champignon was developed, frankly, to address an unmet public health need to save lives from these awful, chronic, devastating disorders. And my view has always been one needed to have not only the promising asset or assets plural, but one needed to have the human capital to be able to implement the development of these products. Because as I said, you know, again, this is where things often go astray. So what we have is I'm in Toronto, where we had our first and flagship clinic, and we are growing clinics, our footprint through clinic acquisition in the United States, and it's an acquisition model. And really by having additional clinics, it provides two opportunities for us. It's an implementation opportunity, that is to give people, for example, ketamine in different contexts, but it also provides for us the infrastructure and the resource and the patients who will be participating in our own clinical research. And we're the only entity like that. We're the only entity in the sense that is, first of all, rooted in 20 odd years of research and developing treatments. And secondly, we're the only organization that I know that has our own clinics that we will be conducting our own research in. And I heard one of our other colleagues earlier talk about repurposing isomers or versions of ketamine. Certainly as an organization, we are interested not only in certainly finding a new moiety, a new medicine, but also new delivery routes. And that's an area that's still wide open for us. So in short, what we're trying to do is address a significant public health need to keep people alive. And I always say that we want to give more years to people's life and more life to their years. And secondly, what I strongly believe is that, and the FDA has been very clear about this, that there's been so much retreat of investment from large pharma in psychiatry because of the high likelihood of negative and failed studies. And then a forensic of that has told us that, yes, you need better treatments or more promising treatments, but really the modifiable issue is how they're developed. And we've completely disintermediated the process, took out the intermediary, and we do it ourselves. So it's a completely novel way of doing treatments now in the field. And I have it's always difficult to be certain, but I have a very high level of confidence that that's what we're going to need to get us where we need to be for our patients.